All right, so last week, if I'm correct here, because they asked me if we were starting in chapter 28, and I was like, I think we did that last week. So as long as I'm correct with that, I think we had just finished up with chapter 29, we're in the middle of Job's final speech that he gives. He does talk a little bit more, but this is his final speech. It continues on going through chapter 30 and 31. Last week we kind of were talking about how Job was going back and kind of remembering his past, and he kind of said something that made me think about how we sometimes, at least I do, don't think about the fact that things are going to change. Like we're just kind of going along and we're happy with the way things are, and we don't realize that the one thing that's for certain is that things are going to change. Like we know that change is ahead, and sometimes that change can be good and sometimes it can be bad. So we talked a little bit about being ready for when it goes bad. Just because things are going good right now doesn't mean they're going to continue to go well as we go on. So do we recognize and enjoy the blessings that we have right now, or are we always looking to the future or things like that? One thing that I always, whenever we're talking about how we live, I like to talk about is, when you're always looking to the future, you never get to live in the now. Like, some people are always like, when they're in high school, I can't wait till I graduate high school, and then I can't wait till I graduate college, and then I can't wait till I retire. Well, if you can't wait until the end of all these things, where do you get to at the end? You die. That's the end of it, right? So we shouldn't always be looking to the next thing. We should be living here and now, and in the moment. So if we don't, we really need to do that rather than always focusing on the future. Obviously, that doesn't mean that we don't plan things for the future or that we don't prepare for the future, but our focus should be on the here and now, and because we don't want to put off what's important to the future. I was watching a movie and it said, someday, somebody said something about someday, and one of the other characters said, well, someday is just another way of saying never. Someday I'm going to do this. It just means it's never going to happen. That's not a word-for-word quote from the movie, but, you get the point. Do we put too much focus on that future? We need to make sure that we are focused on the here and now. And then also we wanted to emphasize that, do we show others that we're grateful for what God has done for us? And how do we show that gratefulness so that people can see it in our lives? I think that all those things are important, and those are things that we saw, or that we can kind of glean out of Job's discussion here in 28 and 29. So we're ready for chapter 30. If one of you guys back there would be able to read the first 15 verses here. Now Job is going to move back from talking about his past and go back to what his current condition is. So let's go Job 30, 1 through 15.
But now they mock me, men younger than I, whose fathers I have disdained, to put to sheepdog. Hang on 1 second here. There we go. Of what use is the strength of their hands of me, since their vigor has gone from them? Haggard from want and hunger, they roamed in parched land, in desolate wastelands at night. In the brush they gathered salt herbs, and their food was the root of broom brush. They were banished from human society, shout as if they were thieves. They were forced to live in the dry stream beds, among rocks and holes in the ground. They brayed among the brushes, and huddled undergrowth. In a base of nameless broad, they were driven out of the land. And now the young men mock me in song. I have been byword among them. They detest me and keep their distance. They do not hesitate to spit in my face. Now that God has unstrung my bow and afflicted me, they throw off restraint in my presence. On the tribe attacks. They lay snares for my feet. They build siege ramps against me. They break up my road. They succeed in destroying me. No one can help him, they say. They advance though gaping breach. Among the ruins they come rolling in. Terrors overwhelm me. My dignity is driven away by the wind. My safety vanishes like a cloud.
All right, so here I'm not completely sure of who Job is talking about in these verses, like what specific people he has in mind, though he seems to have some specific people in mind. The commentaries that I was reading seem to talk about how Job is suffering at the hand of young vagabonds because of his horrible condition. So people who are just kind of the outcasts of society or the dregs of society. It also almost sounds as though these are people that Job may have had a hand in expelling from society in the way that he talks about it there, for the common good. As we talked about last week, Job seemed to have some kind of a high position in his town or village or whatever there, and that he may have had a role in some of these people being expelled or whatever, and then now they're doing this to him. And because of his weakened position, they're able to take advantage of the situation. It also sounds like maybe Job is paranoid at this point because of everything that's been happening to him, and he's like, what can happen next? Almost. And that would probably make sense because what good has happened to him in the last little bit of time? Like we said, we don't know exactly how long of a period of time has happened here, but we know that there's been some time passage from the beginning of his ordeal till now. So however long that's been, has there been anything good come his way? Not really. So he's probably just kind of like, what could happen next at this point? Anybody, I don't really have any questions on that part. Anybody have anything that they noticed or comments on that before we move on to the next part of the chapter? All right, so let's go ahead. If one of you guys would read 16 through 31.
And now my life ebbs away. Days of suffering grip me. Night pierces my bones. My gnawing pains never rest. In his great power, God becomes like clothing to me. He binds me like the neck of my garment. He throws me into the mud, and I am reduced to dust and ashes. I cry out to you, God, but why do you not answer? I stand up, but you merely look at me. You turn on me ruthlessly. With the might of your hand, you attack me. You snatch me up and drive me before the wind. You toss me about in the storm. I know that you will bring me down to death, to the place appointed for all the living. Surely no one lays a hand on a broken man when he cries for help in his distress. Have I not wept for those in trouble? Has not my soul grieved for the poor? Yet when I hoped for good, evil came. When I looked for light, then came darkness. The churning inside me never stops. The days of suffering confront me. I go about blackened and not by the sun. I stand up in the assembly and cry for help. I have become a brother of jackals, a companion of owls. My skin grows black and peels. My body burns with fever. My lyre is tuned to mourning, and my pipe to the sound of wailing.
All right, so here he describes how much torment he is going through. He can't ever relax. He's always on edge. That'll cause paranoia again as well. And here now he goes back to blaming God for his condition when he's talking about this. He's devastated that God has deserted him, and he thinks God will bring him to death. True, as we all, like I was saying, that's our end of our journey here on earth. We will all die. But I don't think that Job at this point is talking about just the normal course of life ending in death. He's talking about being tormented until he dies and going, just basically at the end, it's going to bring me to death. So I think he's just in a bad place at this point. He then discusses how he tried to help others, and when he expected good, things went sideways. So what he was thinking would happen didn't happen, and he's now emotionally exhausted, and he's feeling hopeless. And we talked about that at points here where, what brings us hope and what takes that hope away, and what do we do as we go through these ups and downs of life, and what can we do to sustain through bad times. And I know sometimes I'm talking about how do we go through that, and Charles, I know you like to talk about how, well, sometimes it's just not enough, right? Like sometimes it's just that bad. But I think it's important to talk about what can we do to try to sustain ourselves when those times are coming. And it may not work the way we want it to, but we do need to try to be prepared because we know they're coming. That's the one thing that we know for sure. And I feel like this part of what Job's saying goes back to what we had just discussed last week. We have expectations of the way things should go. And if they're good now, they should keep going well. If I'm doing well, if I do the right thing, things should work out the right way. But that doesn't always happen. Sometimes, in fact, quite often, the bad guy wins, right? Maybe not in the movies. Sometimes they do. Most of the time they don't, because people don't want to see that. But a lot of times it doesn't go the way that we want it to go. But we have expectations of the way things should be. And I don't know if this is the right term, but there's almost a danger of pride. Or I don't know if it's pride or expectation that when we become accustomed to things going the way that we want them to go, or that we expect them to go, or maybe it's a danger of becoming comfortable and becoming complacent. Might be more the right word there. It can lead us to not really living the life that we should, to doing what we should for God. So a couple questions here. What can happen to us when things go from good to bad quickly if we're not prepared for it?
They respond very poorly.
Yeah, our response is going to be different if we're prepared. And throughout this series, we talked about that. What is it that really is strong? We talked about character. We talked about building faith in God and all those kind of things. But if your expectation is that things are going to continue to go well for you, and then all of a sudden it just goes the other way, that can be pretty dramatic, traumatic. It could be either, but traumatic. Depending on what you're talking about, it can lead to depression, can lead to bitterness, anger, any number of things if we're not able to respond in the right way. And sometimes we're not going to. We're going to have that moment where we're angry or bitter or whatever, but the goal is to try to be prepared for it and to have that relationship with God and to be faithful and to be able to handle those things when they come. And what should our response be? We're talking about a good response. What is a good response when things go bad?
The Christian would say prayer.
Prayer?
Definitely listening.
Listening?
Just being present with the person who's going through the really.
So you mean if you're not the person who's going through the bad time, how do you respond? And we talked about that. Yeah. It's like what did Job's? I called them friends for some of the lessons, and now I'm pretty much just referring to them as critics. I mean, they're friends, but at this point they didn't do a real great job of being friends. We talked about how they kind of led him down this path where he's saying some of the things he's saying because he's having to respond to their accusations that he's the one that did all, that he was so bad that's why all these things are happening to him. So they've kind of led him down this bad road. But yeah, if you're on the other side, being there for a person and not necessarily talking, maybe talking, maybe not. It depends on the situation. Also, what you say depends on the situation. But when somebody's hurt, the big thing that we talked about is when somebody's hurting, that may not be the right time to have a big doctrinal discussion, like what these guys are having, right? Probably not the best of ideas at that juncture whenever somebody's in the middle of a painful situation to have that kind of a discussion. But to be there for them, certainly. And we're going to talk, when we get to Elihu in just a little bit, we're going to talk more about that, like, you know, what is a good thing to say to somebody, what, you know, and what do we listen to people? Do we listen to the right people and the right things whenever that's happening? But when you're in the middle of it, when you're the one that's suffering, like if, you know, a family member dies suddenly from something unexpected or is sick, like what you guys just went through, or, you know, any number of things that happen that causes somebody to be suffering, how should we respond at that time? And like we talked about, you know, it's easier to say what we think than it is to actually do it when you're going through it. But once again, I think it's important for us to think about that and to know, well, how would I at least try, or what would I do?
I look at the Apostle Paul, and who experienced a tremendous amount of suffering, and just the amount of consistency that he had. There was consistency in doing what Job did, and crying out, and if I'm going to boast, I'm going to boast about my sufferings. And here they are, you know? And he just like pukes them out there, like, you know, he doesn't hold back. But the other thing that he does, you know, in the middle of that is, whether I'm in chains or not, I'm going to preach Christ crucified. You know, his consistency always points people to God, regardless. You know, whether he's in chains, whether he's bobbing around in the middle of the sea for 3 days and 3 nights, you know, no matter what the situation was, Paul consistently cried out. He called suffering what it was, and he said, you know, I'm going to put my hope in God and in Christ, because his letter to the Philippian church, I don't know when the end is, you know, like Paul almost sounds like he's suicidal if you really look a little closer in the letter to the Philippians.
Well, yeah, because he talks about, I'd rather go.
Yeah.
I'd rather be gone, yeah.
For your sake, you know, I should be here, but for my sake, I'd rather go. You know? It doesn't sound very hopeful, but then he turns back around and he's talking about the importance of living every single minute for God. And it's just that consistency of finding that balance of it's okay to cry out, it's okay to cry, it's okay to be depressed, it's okay to be anxious.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a couple things that I glean out of that are, I think, are really important. One is be honest. Like if you're angry with God, don't pretend like you're not angry. Be honest with yourself about the situation and what's happening. And then and this is where it becomes hard, and I think I mentioned this last week, Paul is a great example because he had a completely, his viewpoint was totally eternal. It was totally, like, it doesn't matter what happens here, it's what happens there. Now, as I mentioned, he had a great advantage because he had actually talked to Jesus. He actually had been, what does he say? He doesn't know if it was in person or whatever, but he had been taken into heaven. Like, he has an advantage in some aspects of having seen some of that. But his viewpoint, if we could have that viewpoint of everything is toward that eternal goal, you know, of what's good for God, and if we really understand whenever the scripture says, you know, everything works to good for those who love God, I think I paraphrased that wrong there, but it's not saying that everything that happens to us is going to be good for us. That's not the point of that scripture. It's talking about when we're focused on doing what God wants us to do and on serving Him, that's going to work for His good, for God's good. It doesn't mean that we're not going to suffer. I mean, if it did, then what's happening? Like, why would people go through the suffering? And why all the other scriptures? Like, you have to get it together as far as what that means. So we know that we're going to, as I mentioned, we're going to go through that suffering at times. But if we can have that eternal viewpoint and really what the end goal is as we're going through that can help, I think. And of course, like we've talked about at times, prayer certainly is something that can help. There's some times where the prayer is simply crying out to God, like maybe not even in words, right? Just at that point, wailing or whatever you want to call it. But prayer, and of course, humbleness and realizing that we need to rely on God at those times, and that we can't take care of it by ourselves, can be something I think that's important there.
Yeah, I mean, talking about honesty, I think sometimes, we've talked about this a lot in this class, sometimes there are no answers, and I think as Christians that drives us absolutely insane, to the point where, at funerals, people feel like they have to provide some kind of an answer for why your 2-year-old kid died. Sometimes there are no answers. Sometimes life just sucks and things happen, and we don't have to explain God's reason.
Or at least there's no answers that are going to be satisfactory to the person in that situation.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, along that same line, and I'm going to be personal here, because part of what Job says, when your skin's turned black and it's peeling off, I've been there, burned severely, and you're in a lot of pain. I prayed, and my prayer, this may sound irreligious, but my prayer wasn't, heal me, fix this, or do that. It was a prayer of resignation. This is what happened. I've got no control. It's all yours.
Right.
And that's not a happy prayer.
No. Well, and that's what the point is. It's not always, it shouldn't all be, life's not all, what is the phrase, not all roses, or what, or you might get pricked by the thorn. It's not, that's what we know. And so, yeah, there's going to be times where if I understand what you're saying you just turn it all over, and that's,
Resignation.
yeah.
And that's not suicidal. That's
Right.
just
Turning it over, yeah.
That sounds like acceptance, not something that's irreligious.
Yeah.
Well, some folks see that as, you don't have faith. No, I was really hurting bad, really bad, and there's just a point where you go, there's nothing else I can do. There's nothing that, doctor's going, we're doing all we can, and you're in massive pain. Guess what? It's time to just let go of that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's acceptance. It's also resignation that this is what it is.
Yeah, I think what
and I'll
Charles,
have to deal with that.
Charles, what I think you were saying was like some people might see that as being a lack of faith because you're not asking for God to heal you at that point.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily the case. You're just resigned to like what Job said in that one point where he's like, I'm gonna stand by my integrity, whatever happens. Like that's where I'm at this point. So yeah. So that in some point, sometimes we might, instead of saying, well, it's going to get better, because you don't know that it's going to get better. That's the point at which you're resigned to, well, whatever comes my way, this is where I'm at. And having that strength to be able to go through that.
I think that's such a powerful passage in Job 27, because in Job's life, literally the only thing that he had control over, the only thing, was his integrity. Mm-hmm. And he said, until I die, I will maintain my integrity. He had lost control of everything.
Everything else, yep.
Health to who stays alive in his life, to his income, to everything. He had lost complete and total control, but he could maintain his integrity.
Yep. And that's where we're going to head right now in 31. Anybody have anything else on 30 before we head there? Because he goes back to talking about his integrity now in 31 as well. If you guys want to read, let's just start with 1 through 4. But yeah, Job goes back to defending his integrity, and he affirms his sexual purity. He declares that his righteousness in the way he conducts business, his faithfulness to his wife, his fairness to his workers, his hospitality, all these things. Where I think if you remember back a couple weeks ago, we talked about how he doesn't respond to Eliphaz And like whenever Eliphaz makes all those accusations and he doesn't respond, and here he responds at this point. So it's a little ways down further in the conversation where he responds to what Eliphaz had attacked him with. And now he's going to say, no, none of those things are what's happened. So let's go 1 through 4.
I made a covenant with my eyes, not to look lustfully at a young woman. For what is our lot from God above, our heritage from the Almighty on high? Is it not ruin for the wicked, disaster for those who do wrong? Does he not see my ways and count my every step?
All right, so here Job discusses his purity. What does he mean when he says that he made a covenant with his eyes? Yeah, what's he going to do with his eyes?
He's going to divert them from things that might grant.
Right, yeah, he's not going to go looking for things that are not what he should be looking at. In today's society, you see that a lot of places, and so we have to be constantly aware of what we're taking in and trying to not allow that to penetrate into us and affect us. And if we can avoid it, which you can't because it's everywhere, but if we can avoid it, we shouldn't be going out to seek things that we're not supposed to be looking at, immodesty and things like that. And Job also emphasizes that nothing good can come of doing wrong because who's going to see it? God will see it. Whether other people see it or not, God will see it. All right, let's go on to 5 through 8.
If I have walked with falsehood, or my foot has hurried after deceit, let God weigh me in honest scales, and he will know that I am blameless. If my steps have turned from the path, if my heart opened, led by my eyes, or my hands have defiled, then others may eat what I have sown, and may crops be uprooted.
Okay, so here now Job's talking about his honesty in dealing with others. He pronounces kind of a self-judgment on him. If this has happened, if I have become greedy and done wrong, then what should happen? Let me sow and another eat, and let my crops be uprooted. So he kind of pronouncing judgment on himself. Going back to what we talked about, he appears to have been not necessarily a judge, but acted in some kind of a way that what we would call a judge or something like that, a ruler. So he pronounces judgment on himself. He had done wrong in this way. But you know what? Probably Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar might say that he had done wrong and that these are the consequences that he's receiving because of that. That's what they've been arguing, right? Is that you had done wrong, and so these things are happening to you. But he's saying that he knows he's done nothing wrong, so let these things happen to me if I have done anything. All right, let's go to 9 through 12.
If my heart is entranced by a woman, or I have lurked at my neighbor's door, then may my wife grind on another man's grain, and may another man sleep with her. For that I have been wicked, a sin to be judged. That is a fire that burns to destruction. It would have been uprooted my harvest.
Okay, so here he goes back again to discussing his sexual purity and his faithfulness to his wife, and he again pronounces a judgment on himself and says, let these things happen if I've done wrong. So how does Job's view of adultery compare with the attitude of people today?
What, today? They think it's a problem?
Yeah, and we talked about this a lot. I don't think we've done it on a Sunday morning, but I know we had a Wednesday night class. That was a Wednesday night class, right, Jimmy? That where we did where I talked about mind over media we went through media. It was Wednesday, yeah. So anyway, we went through a pretty detailed discussion about how media impacts us and making wise decisions in regard to what we allow ourselves to watch and listen to and spend time doing. And with that, we talked about when you watch any TV show, pretty much, what's their view on sex? It's pretty much just that's something people do. Whatever relationship doesn't matter. That's just something people do. I think that most people don't really view adultery as a very serious thing today, or anything like that, and or any sexual sin for that matter. We see what we talked about, not getting explicitly, but not explicit, but we've talked about people's views on sex and homosexuality, what adultery, these kind of things, and it's not what God's view is. That's for sure. People are becoming accepting. Well, and it always has been that way, but once again, coming from our viewpoint, we're not necessarily as used to that, because in America, we were founded more on Christian principles. But in the world, it's always been that way, part of the way people worship their false gods and idols was through immorality and sexual acts and things like that. So that's not something that's new at all. But like I said, we don't see, Job certainly, we don't see, I shouldn't say our society doesn't see it the way that Job saw it, for sure, like as far as basically he's saying, I'm going to hide my eyes with that. All right, anybody have any other comments on that before we head into the next part of the chapter here? All right, let's go to verses 13 through 15.
If I have denied justice to any of my servants, whether male or female, when they did a grievance against me, what will I do when God confronts me? What will I answer when called to account? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one from us both within our mothers?
Okay, so here again, Job is emphasizing that he's treated people fairly, and he gives a reason for that. What's the reason that he treats people fairly?
Because God made them just the way He made him.
Right, because we're all made the same, right? And not only that, but he's talking about that who would hold him accountable? God would, right? God holds him accountable if he's unfair, and then God made everyone. So one thing that this made me think about, and I don't want to go down this road too much, but something that we see in today's society is not necessarily treating everybody fair. There's a new word out there called equitable, treating everybody equally. And there's another word too, and it's slipping my mind right now. But anyway, basically, it's treating people differently, really, in order to make it fair, or what they call fair. Yeah, to get an equal outcome, which is not necessarily fair, because there's different drivers behind what leads to an outcome. And so that's not necessarily fair. So we want to make sure that we understand, that fairness doesn't necessarily mean, or what some people are calling it these days. We need to make sure, like we've been talking about, that we understand what words mean when we're talking. But what does it mean to treat people fairly?
Could be that you want to treat them the way they should be treated.
To some degree, I think, or the way you wish to be treated might be. I don't know that we would treat everybody the way they wish to be treated. Some people might, that would be, you get taken advantage of that way, which isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it's okay to be taken advantage of.
So,
Yeah.
it's like, typically say you treat somebody the way you wish to be treated.
Yeah.
However, I just took the CPMC equity training, right?
Okay, yep.
Well, instead of like the way you wish to be treated, treat them how they wish to be treated. I was like, okay. So that's why I offered that new age spin on.
Yep. So if we treat everybody the way they wish to be treated, that's not, well, we see that actually. As I've been mentioning, how many churches out there no longer call things sin that God calls sin? A lot of churches do. And that's because we're treating everybody the way they want to be treated as opposed to what should be done. And what's happened now is that, as I've mentioned before, calling a sin is now called hatred and bigotry. And so we're the haters because we say, God says this. Do we hate people because we say that they're sinning?
No, but I sure hate the sins.
Right. Because we can't accept, I mean, like when you say everybody here is welcome, we mean that. Everybody is welcome to come here. But we're not going to tell you that you're fine with God if you're living in sin. But that's what they want. And that's what made me think of that whenever you say treat everybody the way they think they should be treated. Well, of course you're talking about treating them. We treat them right, no matter who it is, no matter what they've done. We treat them fairly. But that doesn't mean that we accept wrongdoing, sin. We shouldn't whenever it comes to that. But treating somebody fairly means like what Job's saying here, like God created them. And that means that taking treating them as another person. And why don't people do that? Well, I mean, one big thing is racism and other things that can cause people to not treat others fairly. And so that shouldn't be what we do. We shouldn't judge somebody based off of their race or their background or things like that. We need to treat them fairly. And I know that's kind of cliche because I'm saying that again, but if anybody wants to elaborate on that better than what I'm doing, that's fine. But we just need to realize that God created everyone, and therefore we need to treat everybody as one of God's creations. And then we talked about that too, about how we have the tendency to want people to get their just due when they've done wrong. We want to punish them, and we want to see them punished. But in reality, what we need to do is look at people and realize that they're a soul, and that if they don't turn to God and do the right thing, they're going to be lost for eternity.
That doesn't preclude, and I'm going to kind of split a hair here. I don't necessarily want to see people punished, but I do want to see justice done.
Well, yeah, that's another discussion. Like what we talked about, that God's established. Well, if the government is working the way God tells it to and has established, the Bible tells us that it's meant to bring out punishment on wrongdoers and to do that. So yes, the punishment needs to be had. Should we take joy in seeing somebody die and go to hell? No. So that's really the emphasis there, as far as that. It's a matter of attitude, not that we don't think justice should be done or that somebody should be punished, but that we don't take joy or want to see somebody end up in a bad place. But no, that certainly, you can't if you allow evildoers to just run roughshod over everything, you can't have a society. And we've seen that a little taste of that going on here as well. Okay, well, it looks like we're about out of time for this week, so we'll stop there midway through 31, and we'll pick up. I thought we might get all the way through Job's final speech here today, but as usual, I talk too much and go off topic a little bit. But anyway, we'll pick up there next week, and we'll be back for work.